Good afternoon and welcome to today's press conference. We'll start with opening statements, I believe, from both our speakers, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions.
Good afternoon. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we're gathered today on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. I want to thank Chairperson Lahaie for joining us today. And we are here today because we believe strongly in a simple premise, that Canadians should have confidence in those tasked with keeping them safe. Whether we're in our communities or at our borders, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and Canada Border Services agencies do incredible work to protect our country. Whether a cop on the beat or an agent at the border, the members of the RCMP and CBSA are Canada's front line. And that means that these officers are endowed with significant responsibility and power, including the use of force. It also means that they must maintain the trust of Canadians. And to maintain that trust, Canadians must know two things: that there is independent civilian review of law enforcement, and that there are processes and mechanisms to hold them accountable. L'examen indépendant des institutions et des organismes fédéraux est l'une des caractéristiques de notre démocratie. Cela inclut les organismes de sécurité publique qui font partie de mon portfolio. À l'heure actuelle, les plaintes de la GRC sont traitées par la Commission civile d'examen et de plainte. Bien que certaines des activités de l'ASFC fassent actuellement l'objet d'un examen externe, il s'agit du seul organisme fédéral d'application de la loi qui ne dispose pas de son propre organisme d'examen. Cela signifie qu'il n'y a aucune possibilité d'enquête ou d'examen indépendant des plaintes du public concernant l'ASFC. Over the past few years, we've heard the calls of Canadians nationwide for greater accountability for the RCMP and CBSA. And I want to highlight and thank the many equity-deserving groups such as racialized, BIPOC, and Indigenous communities who have for a long time called for the announcement that we are making today. We've also heard Chairperson Lahaie's calls to strengthen the Commission's review and accountability powers, including for codified timelines to deal with RCMP delays in responding to reports and recommendations. And I want to, again, highlight the tremendous progress that Commissioner Lahaie and her team have made in reducing those delays already. We have made a promise to Canadians that we'd create a new body to strengthen civilian review and police accountability, and today we are keeping that promise. Earlier today, I had the honor of tabling Bill C-20. This legislation will establish for the first time the Public Complaints and Review Commission, a new independent review body for the RCMP and CBSA. It aims to bolster public trust and confidence in these important institutions and assure Canadians that they can expect consistent, fair, and equitable treatment from these two law enforcement institutions. By drafting an entirely new statute, we are reinforcing the independence of this new review body from the agencies it reviews. The bill also introduces new provisions aimed at enhancing RCMP and CBSA accountability and transparency. To improve the promptness of responding to complaints, the legislation would codify timelines in which the RCMP and CBSA must respond to PCRC interim reports, reviews, and recommendations. It also includes a requirement for the RCMP Commissioner and CBSA President to report annually on the status of the implementation of PCRC recommendations, and those annual reports will be filed before Parliament. To help assess and address systemic racism in law enforcement, it requires the PCRC to collect and publish disaggregated race-based data to address systemic inequities and to improve relationships with communities across the country, including Indigenous and racialized communities. The new review body would be required to deliver public information and educational programs on this front. Plus tôt aujourd'hui, j'ai l'honneur de déposer le projet de loi C-20. Cette loi créa la Commission de révision des plaintes du public, un nouvel organisme de révision indépendant pour la GRC et l'ASFC. Elle vise à renforcer la confiance du public dans ces importantes institutions et à assurer aux Canadiens qu'ils peuvent s'attendre à un traitement cohérent, juste et équitable lorsqu'ils interagissent avec elles. Le projet de loi introduit également de nouvelles dispositions visant à renforcer la responsabilité et la transparence de la GRC et de l'ASFC. Afin d'améliorer la rapidité de réponse aux plaintes, la loi codifierait les délais dans lesquels la GRC et l'ASFC doivent répondre aux rapports intérimaires, aux examens et aux recommandations de CPRC. Elle prévoit également l'obligation pour la commissaire de la GRC et la présidente de l'ASFC de présenter un rapport annuel sur l'état de la mise en œuvre des recommandations de CCETP. Elle exige de la CCRP recueille et publie des données déségrégées fondées sur la race afin d'aider à évaluer et à traiter le racisme systémique dans l'application de la loi. Et pour améliorer les relations avec les communautés de pays, y compris les communautés autochtones et racialisées, les nouveaux organismes d'examen seraient tenus d'offrir des programmes d'information et d'éducation au public. The PCRC will be available to anyone who interacts with an employee of the CBSA or RCMP, either in Canada or abroad. And to support its establishment, the government is investing more than $112 million over the next 5 years with regular and sustainable funding to continue after that. I want to thank again Chairperson Lahaie and the employees of the CRCC for their hard work over the last number of years and for raising the concerns that have led us to this point today. Introducing this legislation is one of our top priorities for this session of Parliament, and I call on all members from all sides of the House to help us pass it expeditiously. Cette législation démontre que le gouvernement a entendu et pris en compte tous les points de vue et qu'il est déterminé à renforcer la transparence et la responsabilité. Nous visons à accroître la confiance du public en garantissant la responsabilité envers le public et un traitement cohérent, juste et équitable. Ultimately, this legislation is about strengthening our law enforcement agencies by strengthening accountability, transparency, and in our trust in them. And it will lead to a safer country for everyone. Thank you, merci, and I'll turn it over to Chairperson Lahaie.
Thank you, Minister. I don't have a great deal of remarks to say today, but I will be prepared to answer your questions. However, I will say that I welcome the introduction of Bill C-20. As many of you are aware, civilian review is an essential aspect of maintaining public trust in both the nature and the quality of law enforcement in Canada. And that's why I'm very pleased to see that many of my key recommendations have been included in this legislation, notably statutory timelines for response to our reports. I also believe that the collection of disaggregated race-based data is critical to help assess and address systemic racism in law enforcement. And I'm confident that the government will appropriately fund the PCRC to ensure that we are able to successfully deliver on this expanded mandate. Alors, j'accueille favorablement la présentation du projet de loi C-20. L'examen civil est un aspect fondamental pour maintenir la confiance du public quant à la nature et la qualité du maintien de l'ordre au Canada. Je suis ravie de constater que bon nombre de mes recommandations clés font partie du projet de loi, dont celles visant à établir des délais prescrits par la loi pour donner suite à nos rapports. J'estime qu'il est essentiel de recueillir des données désagrégées sur la race pour permettre d'évaluer le racisme systémique dans les services de police et de l'éliminer. Je suis convaincue que le gouvernement financera convenablement la CCETP pour nous permettre de mener à bien ce mandat élargi. Merci.
Thank you. We'll start with questions in the room, and then we'll go to Zoom if there's time. One question, one follow, and we'll start with Catherine Tunney from CBC.
Thank you. One of the main criticisms of the CRCC has been that it doesn't have binding powers, that it makes recommendations, but ultimately it's up to the commissioner to decide if they want to act on them or not. Why not fix that flaw with this bill?
I want to make it clear that this new commission will have the power to investigate complaints around conduct. And we take the conduct of law enforcement very seriously, as I know the commissioner and the president both do as well. To the credit of the CRCC, and I'll allow Chairperson Lahaie to expand on this, they put forward recommendations around conduct, around grievances in relationship to the service that Canadians get from the RCMP. And it is my understanding that at present, roughly 90% of the recommendations around conduct are already accepted by the RCMP. I would highlight two things. First, it is certainly our view and our sincere hope that as this new commission is created, that we will build on the success of those recommendations around conduct, around grievances, to enhance confidence and trust in these institutions. And obviously the great watershed of this new legislation is that for the first time we have civilian review of the CBSA. That has not existed to this point in time, and so therefore this will be a giant stride in the direction of fostering more confidence in our institutions, and especially the CBSA, who I know responds at present internally, but the civilian review is in response to the calls that have been made for quite some time on that front.
Just to add on to that question, what I would say as well is the fact that going forward, both the CBSA and the RCMP are going to be required to report on the status of the implementation on our recommendations is actually quite significant. That's going to increase the accountability profile. It's going to mean that the Canadian public is aware to what extent they're being held accountable. As the minister mentioned, at this point in time, the RCMP accepts approximately 90% of the Commission's recommendations. I believe that's due to the quality of the recommendations and the work that we do, and I expect that we will continue to deliver that kind of work in the future.
And as a follow-up, there's been concerns in the past about the resources at the CRCC now to be the, I'll get the acronym right at one point. There's a lot of work, more complaints are coming in, probably because you're out there more and more Canadians are aware of you. This allocation of money, is it enough? Do you think that you'll be able to do the work that you need now that you're taking on the CBSA as well?
I think we're going to see how that works out. At this point in time, I am confident that the government will appropriately fund the PCRC to ensure we're able to successfully deliver on this new mandate. We do expect that the number of complaints for our new functions overseeing CBSA are going to be high, and so we will be monitoring that, and if there's a requirement for us to go back and ask for additional funding to be able to successfully complete our mandate, then we will do so.
Jim Bronskill from the Canadian Press.
Question for the minister. Basically, the commissioner of the RCMP was taken to court in order to respond to the interim reports in a timely way, and now you're mandating it in law that the commissioner must respond for both of these agencies. What does that say to you about the culture of the RCMP and its willingness to engage with the former watchdog?
Well, again, I want to highlight the tremendous progress that has been made to reduce the backlogs of complaints that have been previously filed against the RCMP. I know that the commissioner was focused like a laser to reduce those backlogs, and now I'm pleased to share with you that they are very much turning around and processing those complaints in a way that is timely. Codifying the timelines is a way to ensure that we remain vigilant going forward. And as you heard Chairperson Lahaie said, it's not just about making sure that we're turning around the process of these complaints quickly for the sake of speed. It's a way to engender more confidence and accountability in the system itself. And that is something that is precisely done in this new legislation.
And just to follow up for the chairperson, it's early days, but do you have any thoughts on the kinds of systemic or overall issues that you envision looking into concerning the Border Services Agency?
My intent is to take a look at the nature of the complaints as they roll in over once the new commission has been fully established and the legislation has come into force. And we really need to understand the nature of the complaints. We have of course been liaising with the team at CBSA to understand some of the complaints that are coming in. But my estimation is that we'll be receiving more because we're independent and external, and so that changes the landscape for complainants. But at this point in time, it's still very early days, and so we really need to look at what the big complaints are, do some outreach to the different communities that are most impacted by interactions with CBSA, and then I'll be able to proceed with making those types of decisions.
Christy Kirkup from the Globe and Mail.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm just wondering, Minister, if you could please speak to the piece about the collection of race-based data and why that is part of efforts around identifying and addressing systemic racism within law enforcement.
We included the obligation to collect disaggregated race-based data precisely because we know that we have to continue and accelerate our efforts to root out systemic racism and inequities that exist within our institutions, including within law enforcement. And here as well, again, we've made progress. I know that the Commissioner of the RCMP and the President of the CBSA are very committed to making strides in recruiting Indigenous peoples, in recruiting racialized individuals, so that law enforcement is more reflective of the diverse population that is Canada. But including this measure really does, I think, cut right to the core of making sure that we're being upfront, that we're being transparent with Canadians about the disproportionate way in which certain individuals, particularly racialized Canadians, particularly Indigenous peoples, find themselves intersecting with the enforcement, the law enforcement branch of our country. And that data will be a way to inform policies and service standards going forward.
And if I may, just as a follow-up, just to pivot on another piece of legislation, namely the Never-Before-Used Emergencies Act, it came up at committee that the Ottawa Police interim chief didn't ask for the invocation of the act. The RCMP commissioner did not ask for the invocation of the act. I know you have said that there was consultation with law enforcement. You also told a parliamentary committee that the legislation was invoked on the advice of law enforcement. So can you just clear up who asked, or what advice was the invocation of the act based on? What law enforcement agency? Well,
as you heard from Commissioner Lahaie, as well as Interim Chief Bell of the Ottawa Police Service, there were conversations, meaningful conversations between the government and those law enforcement branches to seek advice on the invocation of the Emergencies Act, because the situation was so precarious. And in the words of the Canadian Association of the Chiefs of Police, to which both of those officials are members, they described the events of January and February as being unprecedented as an act of civil disobedience. So naturally, the government would have had meaningful conversations with the law enforcement representatives and leaders of this country prior to the invocation of the Emergencies Act. Both of those officials confirmed that. And prior to invoking it, we had discussions about what kind of powers would be used to restore public safety. And again, here, I would emphasize that not in the words of the government, but in the words of the Canadian Association of the Chiefs of Police, these are the leaders of the law enforcement communities of our country, that the invocation of the Emergencies Act addressed pre-existing unintended gaps in our legislative authorities. So, you know, I appreciate the question very much. We should embrace the scrutiny of the invocation of this act, but we should be very clear-eyed about the fact that there was an emergency, that we invoked the act because it was necessary. We invoked it after seeking the advice of law enforcement on the specific powers that were later then included in the declaration, and that it worked to restore public safety with the least amount of force and with no fatalities, which is again a reflection of the good work that was done by police on the ground in those days.
We'll now go to Zoom, and we'll start with Raymond Filion from TVA.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour, Monsieur Mendicino. Un sondage léger aujourd'hui commandé par la Coalition Avenir Québec, le parti au pouvoir à Québec, dit que 60% des gens au Québec sont inquiets par les passages de demandeurs d'asile au chemin Roxham. 56% disent que le fédéral s'acquitte mal de ses responsabilités au chemin Roxham. Qu'est-ce que vous répondez à ces inquiétudes des gens au Québec?
Tout d'abord, je reconnais que c'est une pression pour Québec. Je reconnais, comme tout le monde au gouvernement fédéral, que le chemin de Roxham est pour plusieurs années est un roue pour des demandeurs d'asile. Et ça, c'est exactement la raison que le gouvernement fédéral cherchait plusieurs des façons de travailler en étroite collaboration avec le gouvernement de Québec. Chaque année, on transférait beaucoup de ressources, beaucoup de l'argent pour offrir d'appui concret pour le gouvernement de Québec, pour la création de services d'installation, pour les nouveaux arrivants, même pour les demandeurs d'asile, qui a des droits que le gouvernement de Québec, que le gouvernement fédéral faut suivre, faut respecter. Ça, c'est une de les valeurs de notre système d'immigration. Et en même temps, on va encore chercher des autres solutions avec des investissements pour ajouter des personnes qui travaillent avec la SFC et pour la GRC pour offrir d'appui pour l'SQ et les autres partenariats qui travaillent avec les forces policières. Donc, c'est un travail qui est tellement important, mais en même temps, je sais que le gouvernement fédéral est toujours prêt pour travailler ensemble avec le gouvernement de Québec.
Et vous avez dit l'autre jour que vous négociez avec Washington, le gouvernement fédéral, une entente sur les tiers pays sûrs. Comment ça va, ces négociations-là? Est-ce que vous avez espoir d'en arriver à une entente à court terme pour colmater la brèche du chemin Roxham?
Merci pour la question. Le statut de la négociation avec les États-Unis est que la négociation est tellement constructive. En tant que mon dernier portfolio, et même maintenant avec le ministre Fraser, qui a le portefeuille de l'immigration, on reste en contact avec nos homologues américains pour moderniser l'entente avec eux. Ça, c'est une de les façons qu'on travaille ensemble avec les États-Unis. C'est un exemple comment nous pouvons renforcer nos frontières, qu'on peut renforcer notre système d'immigration et qu'on peut protéger les droits de les demandeurs d'asile. C'est très, très important. C'est une responsabilité canadienne, c'est une responsabilité des États-Unis, c'est une responsabilité internationale et on va avancer cet important travail en l'avenir.
I'm sorry, that's all the time we have for questions today. This concludes the press conference.
Merci.